My name is Minoru Kawaguchi. I am a 4th-generation Japanese living in Singapore. My mom's side of the family has been in Singapore for more than 100 years. I don't know much about my history on their side of the family. One of the reasons why is because my grandfather, he didn't really share much to my mom.
Like many Japanese Singaporeans from his generation, the war made the past too painful to talk about. But 10 years ago, I found a suitcase that belonged to my late grandfather.
None of his children was allowed to touch it. Fast forward to 10 years ago, I was able to view its contents, and it showed a little bit more about who he was.
And that was when I realized that I needed to find out more about not just my grandfather, but my family heritage in Singapore as a whole.
So there's always been this air of uncertainty, of mystery when it came to my family history. So I decided to go on this journey to try and hopefully fill in the many blanks that I've always questioned over the years. So there's a lot of history that I'm not very sure about because my grandfather passed away when I was 10 years old. So I didn't get a chance to ask him about any questions.
And when he passed, he took all that he knew about our family with him. So this is what I know. Somewhere in the 1910s, my grandfather was born in Singapore. He was the first of our family to be born here. His parents, my great-grandparents, had come from Japan a few years earlier in search of a new life in Singapore. Then the war happened, which no one talks about. And after the war, my grandfather settled down and had my mum, who then had me. But I know little else, and with this suitcase, I feel like I got a second chance to find out more about my family.
This is actually the suitcase that my grandfather owned. You can tell that this box is his because the words Koichi Hirayama is written on it. So inside the box, there are old documents.
Mostly stuff from the war, like this certificate from 1946 that tells me my grandfather Koichi was actually interned in India.
So this is the suitcase that he brought with him when the war ended and everything.
But the war is where the clues end. Nothing about my grandfather's life before that, and nothing about the rest of his family.
I was told by my mom that he was a great man with a very big heart. I still got to see the impact that he left with his children, especially my mother, and how she treats people, and the kindness that she shows.
Which makes me curious about my grandfather's own upbringing. Was his kindness something he learned from his parents? What was his family like? But with so few clues inside the suitcase, I decide to get help from another Hirayama.
Minoru, my dad passed me these photos. Probably we can have a look at them.
This is my cousin Jun, and she is as curious as I am about our family heritage as well.
Wow, this photo looks very old.
Yeah, quite old, son.
I think this is our grandfather.
So that would be Hirayama Koichi, right?
This is the only photo we could find of the complete Hirayama family, with my grandfather Koichi, his brother, his parents, and his grandmother. We know our grandfather's name, so what about the rest?
And then my dad told me that he had a younger brother.
Right.
Which should be this one.
I think there's a photo, which is a tombstone. I think one of the names is his name.
So it says over here that his name is Masaji Hirayama.
Okay.
And he passed away in 1944.
Right.
And he was only 27 years old. So that is very young, you know. And I think this says Hirayama Miya.
Okay.
Koichi's mother's name, which is our great-grandmother.
Right.
And it says here that she passed away in 1930.
Okay.
And she was 48 years old.
Okay.
Which sadly means that she passed away when my grandfather Koichi and his brother Masaji were just teenage boys.
Actually, I saw this telegram over here inside Ji Chang's old suitcase here. Right? And over here, the names are also mentioned. It says, "Dear sir, able to obtain information about your grandmother, Mrs. Fude Sugimoto." So Fude Sugimoto should be this lady here.
That's our great-great-grandmother? And that leaves just one person, our great-grandfather, the man who started our family here in Singapore.
This person here is the only one that we're not sure about, except that his name is
Hirayama.
Yeah. And
But my dad did mention to me that
yeah.
I think he was a merchant or something like that.
So my great-grandfather was a merchant. But what else? June and I try searching for more clues about our great-grandfather, but nothing comes up. However, we did find photos of our grandfather Koichi and our granduncle Masaji growing up.
So I think that's a photo
That's
of
a
him in
photo.
the Scouts.
So cute, huh?
Yeah, I know, right?
Some of these places even look familiar, like this one from Changi Beach.
Do you feel it's a very local childhood? You see, they're in the sea.
Yeah, with the kampong and all
Yeah,
that.
very kampong-like.
I think they had quite a good childhood, like you can tell.
Yeah. So usually when people associate Japanese in Singapore, they think about the war first. Naturally, people think about the negative things. But then we realized that my family were very much part of Singapore before the war. They seemed unquestionably Singaporean, like me. There's this whole pre-war culture going on. I think that's something that I really, really want to find out more about.
I'm curious about the life that the Hirayama family lived before the war, and I'm especially curious about my mysterious great-grandfather. Why did he choose to raise his children here? What kind of business did he run? And most importantly, what was his name? My name is Minoru Kawaguchi. I am a 4th-generation Japanese-Singaporean, and I am on a mission to find out more about my family history in Singapore. I've learned that my great-grandfather, the man who migrated here and started my family in Singapore, was a merchant, but I don't know what kind of business he ran, or even his name. So I head down to a section in the library that allows me to view really old newspapers from the 1900s.
Today, my objective is actually to try and find, through these archives, maybe any link to my great-grandfather.
The only clue I have of my great-grandfather is his last name, Hirayama, so I searched the name.
So actually, the name Hirayama appeared quite a few times. There was a Baron Hirayama, but I don't think it's him, because if that's the case, my uncles would have inherited his title.
There was a Captain Hirayama too, and an examiner Hirayama, but my great-grandfather was a merchant, so probably not them too. My great-grandfather remains elusive, but the search also turns up an article of a tribute for my granduncle Masaji Hirayama. It was made by a local sports club after he passed away in 1944, during the war.
Growing up, I've heard a lot of ladies chased him last time. I didn't inherit any of his looks though, so that's a bit sad, but it's okay.
I don't know very much about my granduncle. From the old photos I saw with June, I believe that Masaji and my grandfather were close, but they were separated by the war, during which my granduncle died unexpectedly from tuberculosis. He was only 27, and my grandfather never got to see his brother again. Masaji must have been a notable figure to have had a tribute in his honor. The article even described the moment of silence for him. What did he do? What was he like? I am eager to find out more.
So after finding out all this information, I was thinking maybe I check online.
I post my search on a few internet forums.
Maybe someone out there might know more. Doesn't look like much, but I can see whether someone replies.
But soon after the post, I get a reply from a woman called Joy Marie. who claims to have information on my granduncle Masaji. I set up a call.
Hello? Yes, this is Minoru. Is this Joy Marie? Oh, hi. You mentioned that you knew my granduncle, Hirayama Masaji.
And what she tells me, I can never forget. Joy Marie says that Masaji was a name she kept hearing growing up. Joy Marie's grandfather knew Masaji because they used to play cricket together. Masaji loved sports and was a talented athlete. Then came the war. Joy Marie's grandfather and his friends were rounded up one day during an inspection. Being Chinese, he knew that they were in danger. But then he spotted Masaji among the Japanese soldiers, so he quickly called out to him for help. Masaji, Masaji. Masaji recognized Joy Marie's grandfather, and without thinking twice, he convinced the soldiers to let them go. Joy Marie doesn't know what Masaji said to them. All she knows is that he risked his life to save her grandfathers, and that is why the story of Masaji has been remembered in her family ever since.
Upon hearing about it from her, it gives me this sense of pride because my granduncle was this sort of man that he, despite all the things of war, he still wanted to help people. All my life when I was growing up, I always hear stories about how the Japanese were evil and stuff. You need to understand there's a very big distinction between Japanese-Singaporeans who were born in Singapore and the invading force. They are two different people. I feel that it sheds a little bit more perspective, hopefully to other people, that not all the Japanese people in Singapore at that time were following orders from the Japanese Empire. There were those who were caught in the crossfire also, who didn't want war, but who just happened to be Japanese, and those are my family.
Knowing that my granduncle Masaji was such a selfless person, I'm more determined to dig deeper about the man who raised him, my great-grandfather. So I head to the Japanese Association of Singapore to see if they might know anything.
Japanese Association published this book titled Prewar Japanese Community in Singapore.
Mr. Kazuo Sugino was the Secretary General of the Japanese Association in Singapore for over 27 years.
My great-grandfather's name, I only know his surname is Hirayama. Do you think his name might be in a record somewhere?
Well, I have quite a number of the document, and then if I look at this, I can see the list of the members,
Okay.
which is quite many.
This is the Japanese Association's membership record from the year 1933. It contains close to 1,000 names, which Mr. Sugino says indicates just how large the Japanese community was in pre-war Singapore.
The Japanese population is about 3,000, 4,000 at peak.
Okay,
Yes.
really?
We searched through the list, and eventually, I recognized a name with the characters Hirayama, but I can't make out the rest of it.
So Sugino-san, can you tell me what characters these are?
Wow, it's quite difficult. Ryuji.
Ryuji Hirayama. At last, I believe I may have found my great-grandfather's name, and as luck would have it, the list also included his business information.
Company's name is here. Nanyo Soko, number 6 Battery Road. Nanyo Soko is logistic,
Okay.
As a merchant, owning a logistics company makes perfect sense to me.
Singapore River
Okay.
is a business district.
So if Ryuji Hirayama was my great-grandfather, I imagine he might have been an importer of goods from Japan, running his business next to the Singapore River, watching over his merchandise as they are carried from the boats. He might have built his business from scratch, all for a better life for him and his family. I would like to think that my great-grandfather was successful, and his warehouse was always bustling with activity. I asked Mr. Sugino if he has any more information on Ryuji Hirayama, but unfortunately this is all he has. However, he does have something about another Hirayama he'd like to show me.
Actually, in this book, the 100-year history of the Japanese community in Singapore, I wrote about your grandfather,
Okay.
Hirayama Koichi is quite well known among the Japanese.
Okay,
Yes.
really?
Mr. Sugino tells me that in the aftermath of World War II, the entire Japanese population in Singapore was moved to Jurong to await repatriation to Japan. According to his research, my grandfather Koichi was one of the handful of Japanese requested to stay, which he was allowed to do eventually.
Do you know why they requested to stay?
Your grandfather was born in Singapore.
Yes, he was.
I presume that at the time, Hirayama-san attachment to the Singapore is already great. He was brought up here and then study in Singapore. Your grandfather feel that Singapore is their home. You see.
As much as he was Japanese, learning that my grandfather Koichi felt he belonged in Singapore makes me feel more strongly as a Singaporean.
When I initially came down here, I wasn't hoping for much.
But then we found a name that could be my great-grandfather.
Felt like a moment of satisfaction, because it connected to so much more. It connected to who he was as a person. It connected to what he did.
And learning about how my grandfather Koichi fought for his family to stay in Singapore, that made me proud.
I feel more Singaporean than Japanese. They chose to stay. They really loved Singapore, and it was directly after the war. There was a lot of animosity, but yet they choose to stay.
I'm now curious about the early Japanese community Mr. Sugino mentioned. I never knew such a large community existed here. Perhaps finding out more about it will bring me closer to my great-grandfather's family. I am Minoru Kawaguchi, a 4th-generation Japanese-Singaporean. The discovery of an old family photo has led me on a search to uncover more about my family's heritage. I've learned that my ancestors were part of a large community of Japanese in Singapore before the war. So I meet with a historian to find out more.
And Minoru, we are at the middle road now.
Professor Daisuke Nishihara is the author of the book, The Japanese in Singapore. Today, he has agreed to bring me around to rediscover the vanished town where the Japanese community used to live in.
And this is the center of Japanese community before the World War II.
Wow.
Professor Nishihara tells me that this area was once called Little Japan, and its streets would have been bustling with all sorts of Japanese stores and businesses. There would have been photography studios, value-for-money hair salons and grocery stores, as well as highly skilled doctors and dentists who were popular among other locals too. This was where the local Japanese lived and worked, and I can easily imagine the Hirayama family staying here too.
We are in the Stanford Art Center on Waterloo Street. And this building used to be the Japanese primary school before the World War II. So your grandfather might have studied here.
Professor Nishihara tells me the Japanese elementary school followed the same syllabus as the one in Japan, as well as the same cultural traditions. And they had many sports activities too, which I know my granduncle Masaji must have enjoyed. Being here in the same building he and my grandfather Koichi once studied in makes me feel closer to them.
Just out of curiosity, what would you say my great-grandfather was then? What would your opinion of him might be?
During the 1920s and early 30s, there was great recession in Japan.
Yeah.
And many Japanese thought that going to the South Seas, especially Singapore, will be the best choice for them. They chased a kind of Singapore dream here in the middle road. I believe your great-grandfather was ambitious and he was very successful here in Singapore.
Knowing that my family has been in Singapore for more than 100 years, and I've always wanted to know more about who we were and how did we live our life. So when Professor Nishihara brought me around, I am actually very grateful that I got to reminisce how life was like back then for them.
To complete my journey, I meet with my cousin Jun again at the Japanese cemetery. and we pay our respects to the Hirayama family. My grandfather Koichi, my granduncle Masaji, my great-grandmother Miya, and my great-grandfather. And I share everything that I've learned with Jun. That was considered Little Japan at that time. So you can see all these Japanese-owned businesses all down the street.
All Japanese name.
Yeah.
This reminds me of our photo, the grandfather.
A lot of them dress very similarly like
Yeah.
that. I may not have found out everything that I set out to uncover, but at least now we can imagine what kind of person our great-grandfather might have been, and the life he built for his family in Singapore. As a merchant, we believe our great-grandfather most likely had his business right beside the Singapore River, where he would be wearing his white suit just like the one in the photo. And we imagine his family of 5 might have lived in a shophouse in Little Japan. This was where they would spend most of their time as a family, be it shopping for Japanese groceries or having hot pot in one of the many Japanese restaurants there. And they probably visited one of the Japanese photography studios there as well, where they took the family photo that sparked this journey I have taken. One of the reasons why I started this journey was because I feel like it's so important for me to know my identity. Deep down, I think both of us felt the same way, that our ancestors helped to contribute to Singapore in whichever way that might be small but still something to be proud of. The Japanese occupation was a painful time for many Singaporeans, including my own family. But what I've learned from this journey is that there's always a lot more to history than the one we've been taught. I feel that it's important for someone to hold on to all these bits of history, no matter how painful. The two of us being of the new generation, it's something that we can add on to the stories that we know and we can share down the line again.